Welcome to another operations video on the Willow Creek Railroad. In this video we're going to look at operations on the Concorde Branch. I hope that you've seen the introduction video for the Concorde Branch so that you have some idea of the layout of the branch. The Concorde Branch is a standalone HO scale industrial switching layout that is operationally connected to the main Willow Creek layout. Before we begin our operating session, let's look at a few operational aspects of the layout. Car movements on the Concorde Branch occur in 4 different ways. The first is the movement of cars between industries in Concorde. For example, once a freight car has been unloaded at the freight depot and is now empty, it could be routed to another industry in Concorde, such as to the Acme Transfer Company. The second is via the car float between Concorde and Bucky's Crossing on the main Willow Creek layout. This and the next 2 forms of car movements allow cars to be routed physically off of and onto the Concorde Branch layout. Cars leaving Bucky's Crossing on the car float would arrive at Concorde, and vice versa. Concorde Branch operators use the same fast clock system as the rest of the Willow Creek crew members during an operating session. Operators also have a copy of the schedule for car floats to and from Bucky's Crossing. These items connect the Concorde Branch operationally to the rest of the Willow Creek Railroad. The third form of car movement is via the car float between Concorde and Alta, a fictional off-layout destination that enables cars to be moved similarly to that of Bucky's Crossing. And the fourth form of car movement is via the interchange track with the SP&S Railway. The operating scheme assumes that an SP&S crew would come to Concorde sometime during the session to exchange cars with the Willow Creek subdivision of the Union Pacific Railroad. One final operating note: the Concorde Branch includes both facing and trailing point turnouts. This means that the switch engines will have to run around cars at times to complete their work. To facilitate this movement, the track plan includes a runaround track with a capacity of 6 freight cars. Now it's time to get ready for the operating session. The crew for today's operating session includes Al, who will be running the EMD SW7 switch engine, and Bob, who will be running the EMD NW2 switch engine. Both gentlemen are familiar with the Concorde Branch layout. Before the operating session begins, Al and Bob will review the car cards and waybills so that they know what car movements will be required. They check out the car float, which will be arriving at the beginning of the session, and see that they have 2 cars destined for Alta and 4 cars for industries in Concorde, all of which are on the opposite end of town. Al and Bob notice 2 cars in the yard and see that both of them are destined for Alta. They check the ferry schedule and see that the Alta ferry won't run until late in the session. Similarly, they check the cars at Acme Transfer. Al and Bob next move to the other set of car card boxes. They note 1 car at the freight depot that is still being loaded or unloaded, as well as a gondola on the team track that is still waiting to be unloaded. Neither of these 2 cars will be picked up during this session. There are 4 cars on the SP&S interchange track, 1 car for a Concorde industry, 2 cars that will need to be routed to Bucky's Crossing via the car float since their waybills are for destinations other than Concorde, and 1 car destined for Alta. On the next track, there is 1 car at Valley Fuel and 1 car at Empire Supply, both of which are destined for locations other than Concorde and will need to be routed to Bucky's Crossing via the car float. And finally, Al and Bob check out the cars at Fraser Foods. There are 4 cars spotted at freight doors, but only 2 of them are supposed to be picked up, and both of them will be going on the ferry to Bucky's Crossing. They also note that there's 1 car sitting on the off-spot track. The waybill indicates that this car should be spotted at door number 4. Since there's already a car at that door, we'll have to wait until that car moves before we can respot the car. That's the purpose of an off-spot location, someplace where a car can sit until its final destination is available. Al and Bob now know the status of all of the cars on the Concorde Branch, and the operating fun now begins. For today's video, Al and Bob are going to offload the car float and work industries on the west end of town. They've decided that Al is going to pull all of the cars from the west end industries that need to be picked up, and Bob is going to offload the car float. Remember that Al has cars to pick up at Fraser Foods, Valley Fuel, and Empire Supply Company. So he moves his switch engine to start gathering up those cars. We'll leave the cars on the interchange track for a later job. Meanwhile, Bob is preparing to handle the car float. Before he can start offloading the float, he must first align the pontoon bridge. Since a pontoon float bridge does not have any mechanical means of being raised or lowered, he must rely on the weight of the switch engine and idler car to position the bridge. Bob moves his switch engine to one side of the float bridge, the weight causing the bridge to push down on the pontoon until it is aligned with the car float. The toggle bars are then slid into position to hold the alignment. The hawser line is also placed over the cleat on the car float and tightened via the winch to help hold the float in place. Bob then moves his engine to the other track and repeats the process for the opposite side of the float bridge. Once this is done and the car float and bridge are properly aligned and secured, Bob is ready to start offloading the ferry. With a pontoon-style float bridge, the offloading process also differs from that of the float bridge in Bucky's Crossing. Contrary to lots of perceptions, it is not uncommon for a locomotive to be able to actually go out onto the car float to offload cars. On the Concorde Branch, however, operators are required to use an idler car to keep operations more interesting. Bob moves his engine and the idler car to couple onto the first track of cars. He starts to pull the first track until the cars straddle both the bridge and the float, with at least one car still on the float. This steadies the car float while cars on the other track are offloaded. Bob then uncouples from this string of cars and moves to the other track. After coupling on to this second string of cars, he pulls them entirely from the car float. Finally, he couples onto the first string of cars and pulls them off of the float, thus completing the unloading process. Bob will now move the cars to the yard to classify them and prepare for switching the Concorde Industries. In the meantime, Al has positioned his switcher to start pulling cars from industries on the west end of Concorde. He decides to pick up cars from Fraser Foods first, since he needs to do some jockeying. He has to pick up cars at doors number 3 and 4, but of course he'll need to work around the car at door number 2 that will need to be respotted once he's done working. Al pulls the cars from the first track, then moves to couple onto the car at door number 4. He pulls these cars onto the switch lead and leaves the 2 cars that he needs to pick up. He then returns the other car to door number 2, where he originally found it. Finally, since door number 4 is now open, Al moves the freight car from the off-spot location and respots it at door number 4. He now moves his switcher back to the switch lead. Before leaving Fraser Foods, Al adjusts the car cards in the car card boxes as needed. He also takes the car cards for the 2 cars he picked up and places them in the vinyl holder so he can keep track of the cars in his train. 2 cars picked up, 2 cars to go. Al leaves the 2 cars from Fraser Foods on the switching lead, where he'll pick them up later, and moves to the track leading to Valley Fuel and the Empire Supply Company. He picks up both cars since they both are destined to go to Bucky's Crossing via the Concorde Ferry. Again, he grabs the car cards and adds them to the workspace rack. Al has now picked up all of the cars from the West End Industries that he needs to pick up. The next move is to shove these cars to the yard so they can eventually be loaded onto the car float. The problem is that in order to shove the cars into the yard, a switch engine needs to be on the other end of the string of cars. To solve this problem, Al moves the cars onto the runaround track. Al has been in communication with Bob so that they coordinate their switching moves. So Al uncouples his switch engine and moves it down the switch lead to take a short break. This completes part 1 of our operations video, but there's a lot more operating to be done, and it continues in part 2.